So one question that I have that I think people would really enjoy, and I think I lost you. Okay, there you are. So one question that I have that I think people would really benefit from hearing your perspective on is, um, when we look at the papacy historically on paper in written documents, church fathers, councils, and we see their actions historically, we see that they behave a certain way, and they often were the defenders of orthodoxy. But when we look at the modern papacy, especially with the pontificate of Pope Francis and a lot of the post-conciliar popes, there seems to be a disconnect there. So a lot of times when people are researching Roman Catholicism, they're looking at things historically and they become convinced of the Catholic position and Catholic understanding of the papacy. But then they have this major disconnect that they encounter when they see um, how the papacy actually is functioning today.
Right.
So how do you deal with that disconnect? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a few different theories out there. I'd imagine if you were to survey all the books just in the English language on how to reconcile, uh, the pre-conciliar Catholicism, pre-conciliar papacy with the post-conciliar, that is after Vatican II,
Right.
you're gonna get a different spectrum. One spectrum is the more liberal point of view, which says there is rupture. So,
Right.
like if you have a vein where there's continuous blood flowing through, there's a rupture, and there was new teaching, and the old teaching was repudiated. And then on the other spectrum, you have uh, that everything is perfectly continuous.
Right.
As former now Pope Benedict XVI Emeritus, then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, he coined the term. I'm not sure if he coined it or not, but he's famous for talking about this hermeneutic of continuity.
Right.
And so, that is the challenge for the Catholic. And I think that, just real briefly, because we can't go into all this, we spend hours.
Right.
And my understanding is this: the council documents they were many of the statements in the council are great. Some of the statements are crafted in such a way that it leads towards one or more interpretation, or two or more
Right.
interpretations, and it could actually you could actually tip the scales over to a more rupture point,
Right.
or you could you can intellectualize and bridge it together with the past.
By the way.
Yeah, yeah. So, for instance, uh, the salvation outside the visible confines of the church, for instance,
Right.
uh, that is a doctrine that a lot of Protestants, Orthodox, and even sedi vacantists, those who don't recognize that there's been a valid pope since at
Hmm.
least Pope John the 23rd or Pope Paul the Sixth, or even sometimes before that, that even before Vatican II, 100 years before Vatican II, Pope Pius IX had already talked about the possibility
Right.
of people being saved outside the visible confines of the church.
Sure.
The conditions I mean, the way he spoke about it was that there was no sure hope that anybody could be saved outside the church. And if there was, it would be by these very stringent conditions, such as, number one, you have to have invincible ignorance. That means you could not have had anything, any way to know the gospel or the Catholic Church with
Okay.
with the power given to you by God. Then you had to have been filled with perfect contrition for your sins. All men have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So you have to have had perfect contrition and
Right.
perfect charity, and following the dictates of your conscience, under the power and influence of God's grace. Now, uh, Pope Pius IX talked about the possibility. He never talked about the likelihood. He never talked about that the fact that it actually happens. But when you get to Vatican II, the language goes, it's still swimming in the possibility context, but you could almost see it as the assumption is that it does happen,
Right.
and almost to a great extent. And so you could bridge the continuity with Vatican II by showing that. You could also go all the way back to the 2nd century, some of the sub-apostolic fathers who talked about Greek philosophers like Socrates
Right.
and Aristotle, who
Yeah.
they were followers of, quote, right reason, close
Yeah.
quote.
Just
And
about them having the seed of the logos in them.
yeah. So they were somehow, I hate to say it, but they were, I don't want to say that anonymous Christians to
Right.
follow
Not
the line
not
of
the
Carl. You know, I
yeah.
don't want to follow that. But
Right.
that they're let's face it, these men were not in the side the commonwealth of God in
Right.
Ephesians 2, but yet Saint Justin Martyr and even Saint Irenaeus of Lyon talks about this. So it's kind of a well, I don't want to say tragedy, but it's unfortunate that it didn't get this exception didn't get picked up for 1900 years or 1800 years until Pope Pius IX. Because before that, popes seemed to be very adamant, very clear about drawing the boundary and
Yeah.
saying that everyone outside the church uh, is not, it cannot be saved.
And that's still affirmed. It's just the way that it's squeezed in there is, okay, people are in the church in a very special way. These people are part of the church without really knowing it under
Right.
certain conditions. So the teaching that outside the church there is no salvation, it hasn't technically been changed. It's just, what does it mean to be a member of the church has been or has been explained further.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. In other words, there's two different ways to be bonded to Christ.
Right.
For those who the ordinary way to be bonded to Christ is through the physicality of the sacraments.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Administered by the true church. But then there's invisible bonds
Correct.
that
Right.
that are there for even for those people who are in the church. They have the invisible bond of faith, hope, and charity that
Exactly.
binds the soul to God. So the issue is it possible for people for whom it's not possible for them to have the physicality of the sacraments, or
Right.
the audibility or the cognitive ability to capture the content of the gospel? Is it
Right.
possible for them to obtain the invisible bonds? Well, that already had been conceded for catechumens who were not baptized,
Right.
and for people who died a martyr's death before they reached the font of baptism.
Yeah, and so it seems like a lot of the pieces of if not all, at least most of the pieces of the puzzle were already there. It's just that they've been put together, and it's not so much of an issue of putting together the pieces of the puzzle. It's the emphasis that's put on with the picture. The emphasis is that not that there's a possibility of salvation outside the visible bonds of the church. The emphasis is that it's like everybody's saved.
Yeah.
Everybody's part of this group,
Yeah.
Instead of saying this is an exception, this is something that's known only to God, it is a possibility. It's more saying, I'm okay, you're okay, everybody's fine, you can remain a Jew, as Robert Barron essentially telling in an interview not too long ago that I think you were commenting on. You can stay where you are, everything's okay, because this exception has now been made the rule. And we can know this exception rather than leaving it alone for God to judge.
Yeah. So in other words, the council, or we should say Pope Pius IX, if we're going back to 1863, is when he started to really start putting this into writing. The Catholic Church gave the members an inch to think about these things, and the liberals took 10 miles. So, so the issue is, what kind of error is this? Because it's not a negation of a required teaching, but it is it's it's topsy-turvy. There's
Right.
something has changed. And so, but it's hard, and the liberals know, because they entered into the subjective realm of what's
Right.
possible.
Right.
And with that, you could adjust the width of the bandwidth however much you want.
Right.
Who are you to judge? That's not necessarily true, or it all depends. This is the jargon, and
Right.
that's how they, and they really capitalize on mercy and things like that, to try and practically, and this is where we're getting at, practically overturn the faith.
Yeah, indeed. And kind of bringing it back to the papacy, we see historically the papacy has been, the bastion of orthodoxy, but you look at it today and it seems like that may not necessarily be the case. So
Right.
why still maintain the papacy? Why still submit to the Roman pontiff, be in communion with him, adhere to his ordinary magisterium in some cases, I guess? Why still affirm his role when it seems that there's a big disconnect there?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, us Catholics who are experiencing this collapse, that seems to have been escalating and escalating for the last 50 years. And I would say it's reached the climax. If this is not the climax, God help us. But yeah, so what can we as Catholics say about this? This is what I would say. Uh, if the if you go back to I was talking to a friend of mine recently, and we were talking about, why not Eastern Orthodox, or Egyptian Orthodox or Protestants. And here's my nutshell, which can be expanded to, lectures over the course of months.
Sure.
If I go back to the 14th century, 15th century, 13th century, 12th, 11th, 10th, 9th, what is the moral consensus of the Bride of Christ? It's not
Right.
Protestantism. It's not Protestantism. If you go back for the Orthodox, if you go to the 11th century, go backwards to the 10th, to the 9th, to the 8th, 7th, 6th, all the way back. What is the moral consensus of the Christians at that time? Is it Orthodox or is it Catholic? That's a tough one to wade through. But for me, I see that the papacy is of divine origin, and I see that from the scriptures. I see that from history. Now the question is, does the truth of the papacy depend on its effectiveness?
Right.
That's the question.
Right.
Um, if we say no to that question and say, okay, well, the effectiveness, once that performance goes bad, then we know, whatever, my tennis racket has been beaten up, the net's gone, I need another one. Then we start, we also have to shift that over to the shoulders of the other churches, like the Eastern Orthodox Church. uh, you know, certain councils, they didn't provide unity for hundreds of years. Even iconoclasm lasted for more than a century,
Right.
and many of its proponents being in the East, working from a conciliar point of view.
Right.
So there are certain fires that go up in God's
Yeah,
house.
we would have to use equal scales and see whether Eastern Orthodoxy has equally problematic issues with the
Right.
effectiveness of Eastern Orthodoxy. So,
Right, and then sola scriptura as well. The effectiveness of sola scriptura also has to be called into question. But anyway, going right back to the question, um, God's providence is mysterious, and it always surprises us because, even within the apostles, we had the betrayal of Judas, and Christ knew that was going to happen. Somebody might say, I would say, like Saint Peter, he would probably say, Lord, if you knew that, wouldn't you want to make everything so perfect so that everything works out fine? We don't have any of that.
right.
And somehow, right there from the get-go, in the mystery of providence, we have a monkey wrench thrown into the running engine. And for some reason God allows that. So if can that exist on the level of a local pastor? Yeah. Can it exist on the level of a bishop, patriarch?
Right.
Yeah. Can it exist on the level of the Pope? Yes,
Fair enough.
but that's only one paragraph. We've got more, there's many more things that in future videos, your listeners will know that we plan on making more videos
Yeah.
to talk about this, because I know that there are some lions out there that are hungry to talk about more problems with Catholicism that we're not touching on here.
Yeah. And just for clarification, let me make sure I'm understanding the answer correctly. Are you essentially saying we need to ultimately look and determine what is objectively true about the papacy, and then based on that, that's how we're going to filter what's going on practically, instead of looking at the situation today practically with the papacy and then determining our theology based on that? Is that essentially what you're saying?
Well, that's partially what I'm saying, but I'm also not putting a lock on the door of of that room where we could talk about possible falsifications.
But when we do that, we have to use equal weights and look equally at Eastern Orthodoxy and Protestantism and see if they're guilty of the same problems.
Yeah, and if
Which I
they,
think a
yeah,
lot of people don't do. They tend to look at Roman Catholicism, they see the problems, but they don't necessarily use that same critical eye with Eastern Orthodoxy or Protestantism.
yeah, I agree with you. I think that I have a friend of mine, very very clever guy. He should have been a scholar of scholars by now, but he's humble guy. He told me a long time ago that the Catholic Church is kind of like it's been the teacher up at the board, and I know that the Orthodox would object to this, but just suffer the pain for the moment. That the Catholic Church has been up at the board teaching the class, and for such a long time that all we need is one problem, and we don't need to discuss the problems of the students in the classroom, because hey, once if the teacher's wrong, then you know we can kind of talk about amongst ourselves what we think is right. But this person who thinks they can get up there and teach us, if we can get any problem with them, that's
Yeah.
if the Catholic Church is wrong, then you know, uh, uh, pretty much the Catholic, the Christian religion is up for a new investigation, a brand new reconstruction of what everything means, and
Right.
so I think that that's one of the reasons why the Catholic Church doesn't get a lot of mercy from critical critical.
So it's
Or,
larger. It's what you see visibly when you think of the church and Christianity. People are going to think of Roman Catholicism because it's the largest, it's the most visible and tangible. So that's what they're going to see, especially. Yeah.
yeah. But like I said, I'm not locking that door for that room to
Sure.
talk about,
Sure.
certain things that you and I have been discussing this for years.
Right.
It's impossible to put into a funnel here. But
Sure.
yeah, I'm willing to talk about that. I'm also willing to admit that uh, many things I do wholeheartedly support, which I would argue. There are other things that I would have to admit on air that I'm merely obliged to admit, but I still struggle with. So not everything I say here, or in the future, is law for me on stone. So
There's tensions on all sides and all communions. So
yeah,
nobody is free from those tensions. Everybody tends to, and it seems like a lot of the problems that are being experienced today are prevalent in all of the communities. So it's not just Roman Catholicism.
yeah.
Any concluding
Go ahead.
thoughts? We'll wrap it up here.
Yeah, no, I would just say that, um, to those who are listening who are Catholic, who are struggling with the Catholic Church, or those who are Protestants or Orthodox or of the other Eastern families who may have bitterness, towards the Catholic religion, or some sort, especially in light of recent scandals.
Right.
Just know that there are plenty of guys like Michael and I who are, Michael is not where I'm at, because I'm coming from the point of I would need to defend the Catholic Church.
Right.
Um, but I am there. I am there with everyone who wants to take out full teeth on these issues, and uh, I think us Catholics need to shoulder that responsibility instead of just saying, well, uh, if the Catholic Church is not true, then you have your own private religion and your own private little man-made. That's often what a lot of Catholic you see on the in forums.
Right.
Catholics are always saying, "Oh, sola scriptura." By what authority? By what authority? By what authority? And it gets to be a clanging
Yeah.
noise after a while. And I just want the listeners to know that, from here going forward, we try to do the best we can to not do that. We want to we want to rub elbows and shoulders with people who are really having struggles with this.
Right.
And really, this is almost like we're not at war to prove the Catholic Church here. I'm more of the mindset, hey, this is a disaster. That there's been an explosion. How do we make sense of all this?
Right.
That's what I would say in concluding
Yeah.
thought.
Yeah. And I think both you and I are interested in pursuing truth regardless of where it leads. And, hopefully everybody who's watching this would feel the same. Well, good. Well, we'll do some more videos. If you like this video, please comment on it, like it, let us know your thoughts. All right.